Hello and welcome to C++ Weekly. I'm your host, Jason Turner, and I'm available for on-site training, code reviews, and contracting. Now, in the last episode, I started a series on learning modern C++ by using the tools that are available. And I'm going to continue that now in this episode with setting up your first project and writing a simple Hello World program. Now, at the moment, you might be thinking, I know how to write Hello World, I don't have anything to learn from that, but there's a chance that I will actually show a couple of things that you have not considered before. Now, before I continue, I would like to address the question of why I am using Visual Studio, in case you had any questions about that, particularly since I tend to be a Linux user and I use the Compile Explorer a lot in my examples. Now, the reason is because Visual Studio, with the Clang power tools, which I demonstrated the installation of in the last episode, give us a relatively unique ability to have almost all of the advantages of doing cross-platform development while operating in a single IDE. That is, we can use Microsoft's compiler, which is cl.exe, and get its unique warnings and capabilities while being able to call Clang Tidy and Clang++ and getting its unique warnings and abilities. And we can integrate CPP check and the Clang format tool. Now, it'll probably be a few episodes until I actually get to Clang format, but we will discuss the other things leading up to that. Visual Studio is also one of the world's most widely used, if not the world's most widely used IDE, so there is no question that many people use it. And starting with the Community Edition Visual Studio, which we are using here, it is free, so pretty much anyone in the world can download the Visual Studio Community Edition and be able to follow along with some of these examples. So I think these are all good reasons to use Visual Studio for these examples. Getting the exact same capabilities on Linux is virtually impossible because of the lack of ability to call Microsoft's compiler, and using a different tool such as Visual Studio Code does not give us the same integration with Clang Tidy that I am looking for. So that's basically where we are at the moment. There might have been some other options, but I think this was a good decision. So we're going to start by setting up our new project. And we want to use an empty C++ project. You can see here that I have it in my recent project templates, but if you don't have that in your list yet, you can just type empty and it will autocomplete for you, and you can choose empty C++ project. And we are going to name this one C++ Weekly. And again, empty project. This is going to have absolutely no files in it at all. At the moment, we're not going to be adding it to source control, although I would highly recommend that you use the GitHub integration and create your own private repository for actually keeping track of the stuff that you're doing. So we have no project here at all. We're going to go ahead and create our first source file, which is going to be a C++ file that we're just going to call main.cpp. This will be pretty much where we'll do all of the work for these examples, although in a real-world project you would want some sort of organization and structure. So we're going to create another file. Now, granted, Visual Studio doesn't have built-in support for the particular file that I want to create, but I think it'll cooperate with us here. We're going to tell it that we're creating a C++ file, but we're just going to name it .clang -tidy, and it should be okay with this. And sure enough, it is. And this is going to be the file that our Clang Tidy is going to load its settings from. And we are using this file because this, again, kind of gets us working towards the mentality of cross-platform. We're not going to save the settings that we want for Clang Tidy in the Visual Studio IDE. We're going to save it in our directory folder here, and then if we were to run Clang Tidy from any other platform, it would still pick up the same things. So Clang Tidy has many checks that it can perform. We are going to enable all of them. In a real-world project, you might not want to enable all of them, but all of the rules in clang tidy exist for some well thought out reason that someone had. Some of them are security flaws that can find, others are just coding best practices, modernization, that kind of thing. We're just going to enable them all for right now because we're doing this as a learning experience. Now, we also want to make the Clang Power tools easily accessible to us, and we're going to right-click here on our menu bar and enable the Clang Power Tools menu. So now we have these options. And we're going to go into our settings, and we're going to tell Clang Power Tools that yes, we want it to fix errors that it finds. This will become interesting in a moment. And we want it to grab the list of checks from our .clangtidy config file. So that should be all that we need to do here. Now we're also going to set up our CPP check options. And we want to enable this inconclusive checks here, which gives us some very interesting results. So that chop checkbox is checked. And we have here -- enable equals all. I added that previously, and this says enable all of the possible checks that CPP check can do, including things that it's not sure about. Now, CPP check, I have never seen it give me a false positive, or maybe very, very rarely a false positive on one of its warnings. But in a couple of cases, it might contradict with the warnings that we get from our other tools, and these will be good learning experiences when our tools contradict each other. So we're going to leave that there. And now finally, we want to set our project settings in Visual Studio. Now I have zoomed the UI, so we don't actually are able to actually see the OK button down here, which is a bit disconcerting. Even if I try to resize this, it doesn't quite work. But I think it will be fine. We want to specify warning level 4 to start with. And we want to double check that permissive minus is set, which means it's not going to let us do things that are outside of the C++ standard. This is great. We really want this as our default setting in Visual Studio, and I'm very happy to see that it seems to have been the default setting here. And finally, we want to set the language standard to C++ latest. Now, Visual Studio does not support all of C++ 17 yet, and it does not support really, just pieces of C++ 20 yet, but really that's okay because no one is supporting C++ 20 yet, and we're only into the first few standards meetings of what C++ 20 even means. So hopefully we have our settings all set. We will hit Enter to close that dialog to make sure it's set the settings. And there we go. We should be able to create our first Hello World example. So if you watched my video on using puts, you might be inclined to write your hello world that looks something like this, as I would be inclined to do. This is just going to write hello world to the screen and then exit. So we're going to save this file. So we're going to start by compiling with Visual Studio, and we're just going to hit build solution. And we don't really expect it to find anything here, and it does not. Now we're going to go ahead and run our clang tidy checks. Now remember, clang tidy is configured to automatically fix anything that it finds. So I'm going to hit this on our toolbar, tidy code. So it has applied one fix for us. It says here, clang inclusion of deprecated C++ header stdio.h, consider using cstdio instead. So stdio.h is not actually part of the C++ standard. If you want to use these C functions like puts, then you need to use cstdio. And so it has automatically applied that fix for us. Now we are going to say, well, you know what, this is not really C++. Anyhow, let's go ahead and use our IOStreams header. And if you're following along with examples on the internet, you probably see code that looks like this. This is a fairly typical example. So if we compile and run this now, We are, again, not getting any warnings from Visual Studio, which is not terribly surprising, because we're not really doing anything wrong. But if we run this with clang tidy instead, we get this warning from the Google coding standards, which are sometimes maligned, but those that are implemented in clang tidy are actually fairly helpful. This says, do not use namespace using directives, and this is true. Many people agree that using namespace is bad, even in a C++ file, because it imports all of those identifiers into the global namespace. So it is suggesting that if we wanted to instead, we could do something like using and pull that into the local namespace. And we can even see here that now we do not have a squiggly under cout, but we do under nline. And this starts to become, a bit difficult to manage. So a lot of people today would suggest that it is better to just explicitly name these things depending on the context. There are contexts where you can't, but in these we can explicitly give the std namespace and do this. Now, this is not, with clang tidy running, going to give us any warnings, I presume, and neither will CPP check. But if you are a fan of these videos, then you would probably notice the fact that I would not be using standard nline here. And let's go ahead and run CPP check just to be sure. And we did not get any errors from CPP check. So I would suggest to use our \n new line character here. So this is one of the cases where our tools will fail us, if you will. Now, granted, this is one of my best practice rules, not one of the widely accepted best practice rules, but the tools that we have are not going to be infallible, but they will get us very far along the way as we are practicing our C++ and trying to learn the current modern best practices. So this wraps up episode 2 of creating our initial Hello World for our Learning Modern C++ by using the tools that are available series. Be sure to subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and check out any of the links below.